Carl Jung discovered something that would make every manipulator in the world go pale. Empaths possess a psychological weapon so powerful that when they finally learn to use it, they become untouchable, not invincible, but completely immune to the games that once destroyed them. In his decades of clinical work, Jung documented what he called the empathic reversal, a moment when the most sensitive souls suddenly transform their greatest vulnerability into their most devastating strength. What terrified Jung wasn't the transformation itself. It was how quickly empaths could dismantle years of manipulation once they understood the weapon they'd been carrying all along. The shocking part is that this weapon doesn't require cruelty, aggression, or revenge. It operates through something far more powerful: conscious emotional intelligence wielded with surgical precision. Today I'm revealing Jung's most guarded discovery about empaths, the rare psychological weapon that lives dormant inside their sensitivity until the moment they learn to activate it. Because here's what Jung realized that changes everything about how we understand empathic power. The empath's sensitivity was never the weakness manipulators thought it was. It was reconnaissance. Every painful interaction, every absorbed emotion, every moment of being used, the empath was gathering intelligence. Jung called this unconscious data accumulation, and when it becomes conscious, everything changes. Think about how a chess grandmaster sees the board differently than a beginner. They're looking at the same pieces, but the grandmaster perceives patterns, sees attacks forming 3 moves ahead, understands the psychological state of their opponent through their playing style. This is exactly what happens when an empath's accumulated emotional intelligence becomes conscious. Jung observed this transformation repeatedly in his practice. Patients who had spent years being manipulated would suddenly describe their relationships with devastating clarity. They could map out manipulation tactics, predict emotional responses, identify psychological weaknesses with accuracy that made Jung himself uncomfortable. These weren't vengeful people. They were individuals whose survival had required them to become experts in human psychology without ever realizing they possessed this expertise. Jung wrote in his private notes during the 1920s that he had encountered patients whose emotional intelligence exceeded his own decades of training. These were empaths who had finally integrated what he called their observational shadow, all the data they'd collected while being hurt but had never consciously organized into usable knowledge. The weapon Jung discovered isn't aggression. It's something manipulators fear far more: the complete inability to be fooled anymore. Modern neuroscience validates what Jung observed clinically. Dr. Marco Iacoboni's research at UCLA shows that empaths have hyperactive mirror neuron systems, meaning they unconsciously map other people's emotional states with extraordinary precision. But Jung identified something that neuroscience is only beginning to understand. When empaths become conscious of this mapping ability, when they learn to observe what they're observing instead of just absorbing it, they develop what Jung called psychological X-ray vision. They see through charm to the insecurity driving it. They detect lies not through verbal inconsistencies, but through emotional incongruence. They sense manipulation before it's fully formed because they feel the shift in emotional intention. Jung documented case after case of empaths who reported feeling like they'd suddenly gained a superpower. But Jung understood this wasn't new ability. It was existing ability becoming conscious. The weapon was always there. They just didn't know they were carrying it. Here's where Jung's discovery becomes revolutionary. The empath's weapon isn't about attacking others. It's about becoming impossible to attack. Jung called this psychological sovereignty, the state where external manipulation attempts simply slide off because you see them so clearly they can't gain traction. Imagine trying to run a con on someone who can feel your nervousness, see through your constructed persona, and knows your psychological playbook before you execute it. The con becomes impossible, not because your target fights back, but because they're playing a completely different game. This is what happens when empaths activate their weapon. Jung identified the exact moment when this weapon activates. He called it the clarity event, when accumulated pain finally transforms into pattern recognition. For years, the empath experiences manipulation as isolated incidents: the gaslighting conversation, the guilt trip, the emotional blackmail. Each one hurts, but they seem separate. Then, something happens. Usually a betrayal so profound it shatters the empath's need to see good in everyone. In that moment, all those isolated incidents suddenly connect into a clear pattern. The empath sees the manipulation map that's been running their entire life. Jung described this moment as simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because the empath must confront how systematically they've been used. Liberating because once you see the pattern, you can never be caught by it again. This is when the weapon activates, not through decision but through recognition. Jung observed that this activation changes everything about how empaths move through the world. Their presence shifts. Manipulators who once targeted them suddenly avoid them. The empath hasn't become hostile or closed off. They've simply become conscious, and consciousness, Jung realized, is kryptonite to unconscious manipulation. Think about what happens when you're trying to surprise someone, but they already know what you're planning. The surprise becomes impossible. This is exactly what happens to manipulators around empaths who've activated their weapon. Every tactic becomes transparent. Every emotional game becomes visible. The manipulation can't work because the target sees it forming in real time. Jung documented 5 specific abilities that emerge when empaths activate their psychological weapon. First, emotional forecasting. The empath begins sensing manipulation before it happens, not through paranoia, but through reading micro-shifts in emotional intention. Jung described patients who could tell when someone was about to lie, not from their words, but from feeling the pre-lie anxiety. When someone was planning manipulation, not from their actions, but from sensing the shift in emotional energy that precedes calculated behavior. Second, projection detection. Jung's theory of psychological projection became crucial here. Empaths develop the ability to immediately recognize when someone is projecting their own qualities onto them. When someone calls you selfish, the awakened empath instantly knows this is the accuser's own denied selfishness speaking. When someone accuses you of manipulation, you recognize this as their own manipulative nature being externalized. This ability neutralizes one of the most common manipulation tactics because projection only works when the target accepts the false accusation. Third, motivation mapping. Jung observed that activated empaths could trace behaviors back to their psychological source with stunning accuracy. Someone's anger isn't just anger, it's fear of vulnerability. Someone's charm isn't just friendliness, it's strategic ingratiation. Someone's victim narrative isn't just pain, it's a control mechanism. This X-ray vision into psychological motivation makes manipulation impossible because the empath sees through the surface behavior to the unconscious driver beneath it. Fourth, energy economy. Jung emphasized that psychological energy is finite. Activated empaths suddenly become masters of what he called libido management, the conscious direction of psychological energy. They stop giving energy to people and situations that drain them. They recognize emotional vampirism instantly and simply don't engage. They feel the hook of guilt manipulation and choose not to bite. This isn't coldness, it's conscious energy allocation. The empath's energy becomes available for people and pursuits that genuinely matter instead of being unconsciously drained by manipulators. Fifth, strategic compassion. This is perhaps the most misunderstood ability. The activated empath doesn't lose their compassion, they make it conscious and strategic. Jung called this differentiated empathy, the ability to feel for someone without taking responsibility for their feelings, to understand someone's pain without needing to fix it, to see someone struggle without making it your own. Strategic compassion allows the empath to remain open-hearted while maintaining impenetrable boundaries. This is what manipulators can't handle because their tactics depend on unconscious compassion, on triggering the empath's automatic helping response. Conscious compassion can't be manipulated because it operates through choice rather than compulsion. Jung realized these 5 abilities create what he called the sovereign empath, someone who possesses all their natural sensitivity but wields it with conscious awareness. The sovereign empath becomes what every unconscious manipulator fears most, someone who sees everything, feels everything, but can no longer be used. Here's what makes this weapon truly powerful. It requires no aggression to be effective. The activated empath doesn't need to call out manipulators, expose them, or seek revenge. The weapon works through simple presence. When you see clearly, manipulation attempts become transparent. When manipulation is transparent, it loses all power. The manipulator feels this shift immediately, even though nothing hostile has happened. Jung documented this phenomenon repeatedly. He called it unconscious recognition. Manipulative individuals would become inexplicably uncomfortable around empaths who had activated their weapon. They couldn't explain why. The empath hadn't accused them of anything, hadn't become cold or hostile, but something fundamental had changed. The manipulator's unconscious mind recognized that their tactics wouldn't work, and this recognition triggered avoidance. Jung compared it to how predators avoid prey that sees them. The seeing itself is the deterrent. Think about your own life. Notice how certain people who once manipulated you easily suddenly back away when you start seeing clearly. They might say you've changed in an accusatory tone. They might claim you've become cold or selfish. But what's really happening is that your consciousness has made you unsuitable as a target. Their unconscious manipulation programming recognizes that you're no longer operating from unconscious compliance. This is the weapon at work. Not through what you do, but through what you've become. Someone who can't be fooled anymore. Jung identified 3 stages of weapon activation that every empath goes through. Stage 1, Jung called recognition shock. This is when years of absorbed manipulation suddenly crystallize into conscious pattern recognition. The empath sees for the first time how systematically they've been used. This stage feels devastating. Everything you thought was love might have been control. Every relationship you believed was genuine might have been transactional. Every person you trusted might have been playing games. Jung warned that this stage often feels like psychological death because in many ways it is. It's the death of innocence, the death of the beautiful belief that everyone means well, the death of unconscious trust. But Jung emphasized that this death is necessary for rebirth into conscious discernment. Stage 2, integration rage. Jung observed that when empaths recognize how they've been manipulated, they experience what he called righteous fury. This isn't petty anger. It's the integration of their denied shadow, all the rage they've suppressed while being nice, accommodating, and understanding. Jung wrote that this rage is healthy and necessary. It's the psyche's immune response finally activating. The problem is many empaths become terrified of their own anger. They've spent their whole lives being the gentle one. Suddenly feeling volcanic rage makes them think they're becoming the very thing they hate. But Jung emphasized that integrating your capacity for anger doesn't make you cruel. It makes you complete. The rage isn't there to be acted out destructively. It's fuel for boundary enforcement. It's the psychological fire that burns away your tolerance for mistreatment. Most importantly, when you stop suppressing your anger, manipulators feel it, even when you're not expressing it. They sense that you're no longer a safe target. This is the weapon charging up. Stage 3, sovereign operation. The final stage is when the weapon becomes fully operational. The shock has passed. The rage has been integrated. What remains is crystal clear consciousness, combined with absolute refusal to participate in manipulation games anymore. Jung described this stage as liberation. The empath who reaches sovereign operation no longer needs to fight manipulators. They simply see them coming and step aside. They recognize guilt trips and don't feel guilty. They spot gaslighting and trust their own perception. They sense emotional blackmail and refuse to be moved by it. The weapon is now automatic. It runs in the background of every interaction, providing real-time analysis of psychological dynamics without effort. Jung's clinical notes reveal something that makes this weapon even more powerful. Once activated, it can never be deactivated. An empath who has achieved sovereign operation cannot go back to unconscious compliance even if they wanted to. The consciousness itself is irreversible. This permanence is what makes the weapon so threatening to manipulative systems. You can't fool an awakened empath back into unconsciousness. You can't guilt them back into self-abandonment. You can't charm them back into ignoring their perceptions. The transformation is complete and permanent. Jung compared it to learning to read. Once you know how to read, you can't look at text without reading it. Once you know how to see manipulation, you can't look at behavior without recognizing its psychological structure. But Jung warned about a crucial danger in weapon activation, the temptation to use it destructively. When empaths first recognize their power, they often want revenge. They want to expose every manipulator, destroy every person who used them, use their psychological insight to hurt others the way they were hurt. Jung called this the shadow temptation. Your weapon is powerful enough to devastate people. Your insight into human psychology could destroy reputations, relationships, and lives. But Jung emphasized that using the weapon destructively means you haven't actually integrated it. You're still operating from woundedness rather than wholeness. The truly sovereign empath uses their weapon for protection and discernment, not for destruction. They can see someone's psychological weaknesses, but choose not to exploit them. They can recognize manipulation, but respond with strategic withdrawal rather than counterattack. They possess devastating power, but wield it with wisdom and restraint. This restraint isn't weakness. It's the highest expression of strength. Jung wrote that the individuated person, his term for someone who has achieved psychological wholeness, doesn't need to prove their power. They simply embody it. The sovereign empath who uses their weapon wisely becomes what Jung called the conscious warrior, someone capable of fierce boundary protection without cruelty, someone who can see everything wrong with a person but still treat them with basic human dignity, someone who possesses the power to destroy but chooses to simply remove themselves from destructive dynamics. This conscious warriorship is what makes the weapon truly sophisticated. It's not about being the strongest fighter. It's about being so clear, so conscious, so unshakable in your own truth that fighting becomes unnecessary. Jung observed that empaths who master their weapon create what he called psychological immunity. Not immunity to feeling, but immunity to being manipulated through your feelings. You still feel deeply. You still care genuinely. You still love authentically. But your feelings are no longer access points for manipulation. Think about computer security. A vulnerability is only dangerous when it's unknown. Once you patch the vulnerability, the attack can't work. The empath's activated weapon patches every psychological vulnerability that manipulators exploit. They can try to guilt you, but you see the guilt trip forming. They can try to gaslight you, but you trust your perceptions absolutely. They can try to play victim, but you recognize the manipulation pattern. Every tactic becomes visible and therefore ineffective. Jung identified specific behaviors that indicate an empath has fully activated their weapon. First, strategic silence. The sovereign empath stops over-explaining themselves. They realize that people who want to misunderstand them will do so regardless of explanation. People who want to understand them need minimal explanation. This silence isn't passive, it's power conservation. Every minute spent explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you is wasted energy. Second, selective engagement. The activated empath becomes ruthlessly selective about where they invest attention. They stop trying to win over critics. Stop attempting to change people who don't want to change. Stop fixing problems they didn't create. Their engagement becomes intentional rather than reactive. Third, boundary enforcement without guilt. Perhaps the clearest sign is the absence of guilt when saying no or enforcing limits. The sovereign empath recognizes that people who get angry at boundaries were benefiting from the lack of them. This recognition eliminates guilt completely. Fourth, immunity to social pressure. The awakened empath stops caring what most people think, not from arrogance but from clarity. They understand that people's opinions of you reveal more about them than about you. This immunity makes them socially dangerous because they can't be controlled through approval or disapproval. Fifth, pattern interruption. The sovereign empath becomes a pattern interrupt in manipulative systems. Family dynamics that depended on their compliance start failing. Workplace cultures built on their overfunction begin crumbling. Relationships based on their self-abandonment naturally dissolve. The empath hasn't attacked these systems. They've simply stopped participating in their own exploitation. But the systems can't function without their unconscious cooperation. Jung documented what happens to manipulators when they encounter empaths with activated weapons. First response is usually escalation. The manipulator unconsciously senses they're losing control and intensifies their tactics. The guilt trips become more extreme. The gaslighting becomes more aggressive. The victim narratives become more dramatic. But this escalation has the opposite effect. It makes the manipulation even more obvious to the awakened empath. Second response is recruitment. The manipulator tries to get others to see the empath as the problem. They spread subtle concerns about the empath's character. They position themselves as worried or caring, while actually attempting to turn people against their target. But the sovereign empath's weapon includes the ability to let this happen without defending themselves. They trust that conscious people will see through the manipulation. Unconscious people's opinions become irrelevant. Third response is abandonment. When escalation and recruitment fail, the manipulator typically leaves. They find someone else to manipulate, someone still operating from unconscious compliance. The sovereign empath feels relieved rather than rejected. They recognize that losing manipulators isn't loss, it's liberation. Jung called this the natural sorting that happens when you become conscious. Unconscious people find you uncomfortable and leave. Conscious people find you refreshing and draw closer. Your activated weapon automatically filters your social environment. Jung's most profound insight about the empathic weapon is this: it's not actually rare. Every empath possesses it. What's rare is empaths who activate it. Most live their entire lives carrying dormant psychological power because activating it requires something difficult: the willingness to see the worst in people you want to believe are good, the courage to trust your own perceptions over social pressure, the strength to stand alone when necessary, the wisdom to use power without becoming corrupted by it. These requirements eliminate most people, not because they lack capacity, but because they lack willingness to pay the activation cost. Jung observed that the empaths who do activate their weapon share common characteristics. They've been hurt deeply enough to break their denial. They've been isolated enough to develop their own thinking. They've been betrayed enough to stop trusting external validation. They've suffered enough to value consciousness over comfort. This suffering isn't wasted. Jung called it the necessary descent, the journey into psychological hell that forges unbreakable strength. The empaths who make this descent and return transformed are the ones who fully activate their weapon. They've seen the darkness in others and in themselves. They've faced their own capacity for cruelty, selfishness, and manipulation. They've integrated their shadow completely. This integration is what makes their weapon truly powerful. They can recognize manipulation because they've acknowledged their own capacity for it. They can spot emotional games because they understand the psychology driving them. They can see through facades because they've dismantled their own. Jung wrote that the greatest protection against evil is not innocence, but consciousness. The activated empath embodies this principle. They're not innocent. They're conscious. They've seen too much to be naive, but they've integrated enough to remain compassionate. This combination makes them psychologically invincible. Here's what Jung wanted every empath to understand about their weapon. It's not about becoming hard or closed. It's about becoming conscious and boundaried. You don't lose your sensitivity. You gain sovereignty over it. You don't stop feeling deeply. You stop letting others weaponize your feelings against you. You don't become cruel. You become clear. The weapon transforms your greatest vulnerability into your greatest strength, not by eliminating the vulnerability, but by bringing it under conscious control. Jung observed that empaths who fully activate their weapon often report a curious phenomenon. Their lives become simpler and more peaceful, not because they've withdrawn from the world, but because they've stopped participating in drama. They're no longer trying to save everyone, no longer absorbing everyone's problems, no longer tolerating mistreatment to maintain relationships. This simplification creates space for genuine connection. When you stop wasting energy on manipulators, you have abundant energy for authentic relationships. When you stop trying to fix people, you can actually enjoy people who don't need fixing. When you stop being everyone's therapist, you can be yourself. The weapon doesn't isolate you. It liberates you for real intimacy with people who have earned access to your depth. Jung's final insight about the empathic weapon cuts to the core of why it's so powerful. Manipulators depend on your unconsciousness. Every tactic they use requires you to not see clearly. Guilt only works if you don't recognize it's being manufactured. Gaslighting only works if you doubt your own perception. Emotional blackmail only works if you feel responsible for others' feelings. Your weapon neutralizes every tactic through one simple mechanism: seeing clearly. Jung compared it to turning on lights in a room where thieves are operating. The light itself is protection. The thieves can't work in visibility. They need darkness. Your consciousness is the light. Your clear seeing is the weapon. Manipulators aren't defeated by your aggression. They're defeated by your awareness. The empaths reading this who recognize themselves in these patterns are standing at a threshold. You're carrying a weapon you might not know how to use yet, but Jung's work provides the activation code. Stop trying to see the best in everyone. See what's actually there. Stop doubting your perceptions. Trust what you feel and observe. Stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Let them be wrong about you. Stop absorbing others' emotions. Feel them. Recognize them. Release them. Stop participating in your own exploitation. Withdraw your energy from manipulative dynamics. These aren't complicated steps, but they're difficult because they require you to face what you've been avoiding. The truth that some people in your life have been using you. The recognition that your kindness has been exploited. The acceptance that not everyone deserves your gifts. Jung understood this difficulty. He called it the courage to see. Most people prefer comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths. But empaths who activate their weapon choose truth over comfort. They'd rather see clearly and stand alone than remain blind and belong to manipulative systems. This courage is what separates sovereign empaths from unconscious ones. Not intelligence, not sensitivity, not even suffering. Courage, the willingness to see what others refuse to acknowledge. Jung believed that empaths who activate their weapon serve a crucial function in collective consciousness evolution. They become what he called consciousness carriers, models of what's possible when sensitivity is paired with sovereignty. Every manipulative system depends on unconscious participants. Family systems built on scapegoating need someone to blame. Workplace cultures built on exploitation need people to overfunction. Social structures built on inequality need people to accept mistreatment. The sovereign empath disrupts all these systems simply by becoming conscious. They refuse to be the scapegoat. They refuse to overfunction. They refuse to accept mistreatment. Their refusal isn't loud or dramatic, it's quiet and absolute. This makes it unstoppable. You're not too sensitive. You're perfectly sensitive with dormant weapons you haven't learned to use. You're not too much, you're exactly enough with power you haven't learned to wield. You're not broken by what you feel. You're being forged into something unbreakable. Jung spent decades documenting what happens when the gentlest souls learn to use their natural gifts consciously. They don't become the monsters they feared. They become the warriors the world needs. Warriors who fight through consciousness rather than aggression, through clarity rather than cruelty, through presence rather than force. Your weapon is already inside you. Every painful interaction has been loading it. Every manipulation you've absorbed has been teaching you its patterns. Every betrayal has been showing you what to watch for. The weapon is charged and ready. Jung's work shows you how to fire it, not at others, but for yourself. In protection of your energy, your truth, your sacred right to exist without exploitation. The rarest thing isn't the weapon itself. Every empath has it. The rarest thing is the courage to use it consciously, to see clearly even when seeing hurts, to stand alone when necessary, to trust yourself absolutely, to become sovereign in your own life. You've been carrying this weapon your whole life. Now you know it's there. The only question is whether you'll learn to use it with the wisdom Jung discovered it requires, because when you do, everything changes. Not the world around you, but your relationship to it. You become untouchable not through hardness, but through consciousness. You become powerful, not through dominance, but through clarity. You become free not through escape, but through seeing exactly what's real and choosing your response consciously. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. It was your weapon in disguise. Jung proved this through decades of clinical observation. Now you're discovering it through your own lived experience. The world needs empaths who know how to use their weapons, conscious warriors who can feel everything without being destroyed by it. Sovereign souls who can see everything without becoming cynical. Awakened individuals who can love deeply while protecting themselves completely. You're becoming one of them. The activation has already begun. Recognition is the first stage. Integration is the second. Sovereignty is waiting on the other side of your courage to complete the journey. Write this truth in the comments so you claim it consciously. I see clearly, and no one can manipulate what I see. This declaration activates your weapon consciously. Your words create commitment. Your commitment creates change. When you write it, you're telling your unconscious mind that the old patterns are finished. You're declaring sovereignty over your own psychological territory. You're becoming the conscious empath Jung knew you could be. Your journey matters beyond your personal transformation. Subscribe because you're joining others who refuse to remain unconscious. Every person who activates their weapon makes it easier for the next empath to do the same. You're part of consciousness evolution. Your awakening contributes to collective healing. Like this video because you're marking your territory as someone who sees clearly now. The algorithm responds to engagement, but more importantly, your action reinforces your own commitment to consciousness. You're training your mind to value truth over comfort. What comes next will challenge everything you thought you understood about psychological power. The next dimension of Jung's work reveals patterns that make this weapon look simple. Ancient psychological mechanisms that control human behavior on levels most people never recognize. Forces that have been shaping your choices without your awareness. You're ready for what's coming because you've proven your courage by getting this far. The next layer shows you exactly how deep manipulation goes and why your activated weapon is only the beginning of true psychological sovereignty. Everything you've learned today prepares you for what's waiting in the next revelation. You're not finishing a journey. You're beginning one that transforms not just how you protect yourself, but how you understand the entire game of human consciousness. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.